Good. We're good.
All right, and can you see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Kia. Thank you for joining this evening. I recently completed my Master's of Science in Soil Science, where I studied how different nitrogen management practices impacts crop nitrogen uptake, soil nitrogen, and nitrogen losses, which is why Tracy has kindly asked me to speak on this subject. And I'm also currently working at Organic Alberta as the Adaptation and Resilience Training Intern. So my work as an intern here includes synthesizing research relevant to organic ag and then communicating this in various forms, such as the webinar today, as well as a podcast series. So our webinar topic for today is Nitrogen Cycling 101, Understanding Nitrogen for Organic Farming. And just an overview for our webinar today, we're going to cover nitrogen forms and the distribution of nitrogen in our world, how that nitrogen is moving through the soil to the plant and from into the atmosphere, and also what factors affect that nitrogen cycling. And thirdly, this presentation is going to have a focus on the nitrogen cycle with an emphasis on organic farming. So a focus on organic nitrogen inputs and their relevant transformations and soil health. And whether this material is new to you or perhaps a refresher from a course, I hope that you're going to gain a fundamental understanding of how nitrogen moves through our world and how different management practices can affect the different stages of the nitrogen cycle, including nitrogen availability for crops and soil nitrogen. So first of all, why is nitrogen so important? Well, it's an essential element for plants and animals, and it's a building block for plant life. Nitrogen is a key component in amino acids, and those are building blocks of proteins in plants. And proteins are essential for growth and development. Nitrogen is also a major part of chlorophyll, which allows plants to perform photosynthesis. And it's also fundamental for DNA and RNA synthesis for plant growth and reproduction. So of course, as nitrogen is essential for plant life, this nitrogen is going to affect plant growth and impacts yields and productivity. And nitrogen is also a key component of soil organic matter. In fact, 5% of soil organic matter is nitrogen. And so nitrogen is also essential for soil health. And then also, nitrogen is the most common limiting nutrient for crop production. However, on the other hand, too much nitrogen isn't good for the plant either or for the environment. And understanding the nitrogen cycle can help us understand how to enhance crop productivity and build and maintain soil health, as well as promote sustainability. So for the distribution of nitrogen, where is it present in our world? This table on the right shows the distribution of nitrogen. And you'll see that most of the nitrogen is present in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. So that's 99% of the total nitrogen. However, that nitrogen gas in the atmosphere is inert. There's also a large amount present in the sea and a significant amount in the soil plant system as well. So while this nitrogen gas is abundant in the atmosphere, it's inert or non-reactive, and that's due to that triple bond between the two nitrogen atoms. So what that means is that it's not directly usable for most organisms. In fact, first, this nitrogen gas must be converted or fixed into reactive forms of nitrogen. So reactive nitrogen means that the nitrogen is available to all living organisms, such as plants or microbes for different biological or chemical reactions. So essentially, reactive nitrogen, it's all forms of nitrogen except for nitrogen gas. And reactive nitrogen can be formed from natural or human sources. And here is just a diagram showing total reactive sources of reactive nitrogen. So we have natural fixation from the ocean, plants, lightning, and volcanoes, as well as from human sources such as pollution or from agricultural activities such as fertilizer. An important thing to note is that human activity has really increased the amount of reactive nitrogen in our world. You can see that's making up 50% of total nitrogen fixation. And that has a lot of environmental implications for biodiversity, for our air and water quality, and for our human health. So soil nitrogen is made up of both organic and inorganic forms of nitrogen. Organic nitrogen has its origin in living material, and it has carbon and hydrogen bonds. So an example would be amino acids in proteins. On the other hand, organic nitrogen is also referred to as mineral nitrogen, and it occurs in non-carbon containing compounds like nitrate. So the graph here is a map of the global soil total nitrogen, so organic and inorganic components, and those darker purple areas indicate higher soil nitrogen. You can see that in Canada, our soils are actually fairly high in soil nitrogen. And most of this nitrogen in the soil is present in its organic form in soil organic matter. So in fact, 98% of nitrogen in the soil is present in its organic form. On the other hand, inorganic nitrogen or mineral nitrogen, such as ammonium or nitrate, accounts for just a small fraction of soil nitrogen, only about 1 to 2%. But of course, that percentage can be altered by fertilization. So plant available nitrogen is an inorganic form in ammonium and nitrate. And these forms are commonly managed in agricultural systems, and it's the main source of nitrogen for most crops. Nitrate is the preferred form of nitrogen for plant uptake, and that's because plants have evolved with a preference for nitrate, since ammonium is typically rapidly converted to nitrate. And also at high concentrations, ammonium can be toxic for plants. So now that we've gone over these different forms of nitrogen and its distribution, let's delve into the different steps in the nitrogen cycle. So how is nitrogen changing form and moving within this soil plant system? And this diagram here, we're going to be referring to it throughout the webinar as a sort of roadmap as we go over the different steps or processes of the nitrogen cycle. So first of all, how is that atmospheric nitrogen, which is 99% of total nitrogen, becoming reactive nitrogen? That's through 3 processes.
Right.
We have atmospheric fixation,
Thunders,
yeah, there's been thunder.
Industrial fixation through the production of synthetic fertilizer, as well as biological nitrogen fixation.
Aesobia.
I'll just remind everyone to please mute themselves. Thank you. So for nitrogen fixation, with atmospheric fixation, this occurs with lightning. So lightning has enough energy from its high temperatures to actually break that triple bond of nitrogen gas. So that breaks that dinitrogen gas, and it causes the nitrogen and oxygen molecules in the atmosphere to react and form nitrogen oxides. And then these nitrogen oxides, they actually dissolve in rainwater and they form nitric acid. And that then can fall to the ground in rain and supply nitrate to the soil. The Haber-Bosch process is an industrial process, and it uses high pressure to cause a chemical reaction between nitrogen and hydrogen to form ammonia. And that ammonia is a base for synthetic inorganic nitrogen fertilizers. Well, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers is not used in organic farming. I think it's still important to note that the use and addition of synthetic inorganic nitrogen fertilizer has vastly increased the amount of reactive nitrogen, and that has actually upset the nitrogen cycle. So our third process of nitrogen fixation is biological nitrogen fixation. So this was actually first discovered by scientists in the late 19th century. So in 1886, scientists discovered that plants with nodules can actually fix atmospheric nitrogen. And in 1901, they discovered that bacteria were actually living in those nodules. So instead of a chemical process like lightning or the Haber-Bosch process, Biological nitrogen fixation, it's carried out by a specialized group of organisms called prokaryotes. And those organisms use the enzyme nitrogenase to convert atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia. So because nitrogen gas is a very stable compound, it takes a lot of energy to break this bond. And then plants, they can use this ammonia and they can use it for amino acids for plant growth and development. With symbiotic nitrogen fixation, the plant itself actually provides energy to those organisms. So they provide carbon compounds and sugars as an energy source for the bacteria. And in exchange, those plants receive that fixed nitrogen. And those relationships between the plant and the bacteria are species specific. So for instance, symbiotic nitrogen fixation may occur between non-legumes, such as the Frankia species and the alder trees, or between the legume species and different bacteria, such as the Rhizobium species. And this table on the right here just shows some example of different legume species and their associations with the Rhizobium species. And that Rhizobium species is doing the nitrogen fixing. And how much nitrogen is supplied and the nitrogen requirements of a plant will depend on a lot of factors, but it's estimated that this symbiotic nitrogen fixation can meet 25 to 90% of plant nitrogen requirements. So while nitrogen fixation can be substantial, it also depends on a variety of factors. So for instance, with a low pH, usually around less than 6, that's going to impair rhizobial activity and reduce nitrogen fixation. And the amount of nitrogen fixed is also going to depend on the amount of nitrogen already in the soil. So the legumes are going to prefer the nitrate and ammonium already in the soil. So if you have a soil that's high in nitrogen, you're going to have less nitrogen fixation. And also high levels of nitrogen also reduce the nitrogenase activity, which is that enzyme responsible for nitrogen fixation. Other limiting factors are also going to affect the fixation, such as environmental conditions, so like water availability or other nutrients. So since those will impact the growth of the plant and will impact the fixation. So if you have more growth and more biomass accumulation, you'll see more nitrogen fixation. And then lastly, the amount of nitrogen fixed, it's going to depend on the species. So the table on the right here shows some typical nitrogen, the amounts of typical nitrogen fixed depending on the species. So alfalfa and clover will typically fix more than, say, beans and lentils. So how much nitrogen is supplied to the subsequent crop after this legume crop, it's going to depend on the quantity of the nitrogen fixed, which of course will depend on the species and the other factors that we discussed on the previous slide. And it's also going to depend on the amount of residue returned. So this example from Martins and colleagues from a paper in 2004 found that depending on the species, up to 62 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare could be supplied to the subsequent oat crop in Manitoba. So another example is in this table here. So there will be different nitrogen credit or the amount of nitrogen available to the next crop, depending on the cover crop biomass, and also depending on whether there's a forage or a grain legume. So forage legumes will typically have higher levels of nitrogen fixation and accumulation, and thus more nitrogen available for the next crop due to a greater root biomass. So at this point, I just want to do a quick shout out to the nutrient budgeting app. This can help you plan and add up the nitrogen credits from legumes and plan your crop rotation. And it's been developed in the Canadian prairies. And I also want to shout out the Green Manure Toolkit, which gives you advice and guides you on choosing an appropriate green manure. And I've put the links here in case you want to take a photo, or after this presentation, I can always go back to the slide. So we've covered the different pathways for nitrogen fixation and how that inert nitrogen gas in the atmosphere becomes available to the plant and to the soil. Another way that nitrogen is deposited is actually from atmospheric nitrogen deposition, which I've added to this diagram of the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen in the form of NOx, or nitrogen oxides, and ammonia are produced via industrial processes such as combustion of fossil fuel, burning of coal, natural gas, even from our vehicles, and this all releases reactive nitrogen back into the atmosphere. And this reactive nitrogen can make its way back to the Earth's surface via rain or in snow or dust, or can even be absorbed in gaseous form by the plant itself. So here's just an example of some spatial patterns of nitrogen deposition. So in these maps, green indicates lower deposition amounts, while yellow, orange, and red indicate higher deposition amounts. So you can see that overall nitrogen deposition amounts are relatively small, usually less than 1 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. But you'll also see some red and yellow hotspots, and that's due to emission sources from areas with higher industrial activity. And these spatial patterns are also going to depend on, besides the source of the emissions, the atmospheric transport, and rain and snow precipitation patterns. So the next stage in the nitrogen cycle we will discuss is mineralization. So soil organic matter has many important functions, but it's also a key source of nitrogen. And again, the majority of soil nitrogen, it's present in the organic form in soil organic matter. And of course, we can also add organic nitrogen in the form of crop residues, manure, or compost. So in the process of mineralization, microbes, they break down this organic nitrogen, whether it be from crop residues, manure, compost, or soil organic matter, and they convert it into ammonia, which is a form of inorganic nitrogen. And microbes, they actually do this. They break down this organic matter for their own energy requirements, and in the process, they release inorganic nitrogen. So mineralization takes place in 2 steps. In the first step, ammonization, there's larger molecules of organic nitrogen like proteins. They're broken down by microbes to amino acids, amines, and urea. And in the second step, ammonification, those amino acids, those amines, and the urea, they are further broken down to ammonium, a plant available form of nitrogen. So many different factors influence the rate of mineralization, and because mineralization converts organic nitrogen to inorganic nitrogen, these various factors will also influence nitrogen availability after applying an organic amendment. So in this top graph here is the effect of soil moisture, and that's represented by water holding capacity. And we can see that at a higher soil moisture or higher water holding capacity, the rates of mineralization increase. And that's because microbes require water for their metabolic processes. On the bottom graph here is the effect of soil temperature, and with increasing temperature, we have more rapid mineralization. And this is because microbial activity increases with increasing temperature. This is actually referred to as a Q10 of 2, which just means that when there's a 10 degrees Celsius increase, there's also a doubling of microbial activity. And then soil management will also affect mineralization when we have more soil disturbance, like tillage, that increases the amount of oxygen and can increase mineralization rates. And quantity of the substrate, when we have more substrate, we're actually feeding the microbial population, and that can actually increase the rate of mineralization. And then as well as the quality of the substrate. So that would be just how easy the substance is to decompose. So in this graph, 100% rye, it takes longer compared to 100% vetch due to the higher carbon content of the rye. So while mineralization is the conversion of organic nitrogen to inorganic nitrogen, the reverse can also happen in the process of immobilization. So immobilization is the conversion of inorganic nitrogen to organic nitrogen, and it's also performed by microbes. So immobilization of nitrogen will occur if microbes, they actually need more nitrogen when decomposing substances. So they end up taking up or assimilating that inorganic nitrogen, and they convert it back to organic nitrogen. And whether mineralization or immobilization occurs depends on the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is the amount of carbon relative to the amount of nitrogen of the organic material added. So soils, they generally have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 10 to 1. And microbes, once again, they break down these organic substances for energy. But whether mineralization or immobilization occurs depends on the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the substrate, so that the microbes can maintain their own internal carbon to nitrogen ratio. So the rule for this is that if the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the substrate is less than 25 to 1, so lower in carbon, net mineralization will occur and inorganic nitrogen will be released to the soil. On the other hand, if it's greater than 25 to 1, the substrate is high in carbon, so that's too little nitrogen for the microbes, so immobilization will occur. The microbe's going to take up that inorganic nitrogen, converting it back to organic nitrogen, and that's to maintain their own internal carbon to nitrogen ratio. So when immobilization occurs, that temporarily ties up some of that nitrogen, making it temporarily unavailable for plant uptake. But this immobilized nitrogen, it can be incorporated into the soil organic matter pool or could even later undergo mineralization. So I was kind of getting into the details of what happens with organic substances like soil organic matter or manure when it's added to the soil. But the key thing to take away here is that by adding organic materials, you're adding back in both carbon and nitrogen, and those are both essential components to organic matter, which has so many benefits as depicted in this photo. So by adding organic materials, microbes, they're breaking this down, and there will be temporary changes in the inorganic nitrogen levels depending on the carbon to nitrogen ratio. But the bottom line is that you're building soil organic matter and supplying nitrogen and carbon to the soil. So here's just an example of how different management practices, in this case, crop rotation and inputs, impacted soil organic carbon over a 70-year period. So because carbon and nitrogen are very closely associated, when we're building soil organic matter, we're building both organic carbon and organic nitrogen in the soil. So in this top graph, we have a wheat fallow rotation, while the bottom graph shows a 5-year rotation of wheat, barley, oats, and 2 forages, and those forages were alfalfa and brome grass. And for treatments, there's a control with no nutrient additions in black, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer in the red, and the manure in the blue. And we can see in that top graph, in that 2-year rotation, there's actually a decline in soil organic carbon, except if manure is added to replace the carbon and nitrogen losses from harvest and fallow. With the 5-year rotation, this actually maintains soil organic carbon, and that's because carbon and nitrogen is being replaced by the nitrogen fixation of the alfalfa and even raised when manure is added. And then another example is the use of cover crops to build and maintain soil organic matter and sustain nitrogen supply. So this is an example from a recent paper published on how cover crops impact soil health in an irrigated organic farm. And the study found that actually cover crops positively impacted soil organic carbon 80% of the time and soil nitrogen 60% of the sampling time. So both these examples really emphasize that by applying organic nitrogen sources like manure or crop residues, cover crops, we're not just supplying nitrogen, but we're also building soil organic matter and soil health. So let's head back to our nitrogen cycle diagram. We've just discussed mineralization, which is the conversion of organic nitrogen to inorganic nitrogen, and the reverse of that, immobilization. So after mineralization, we have ammonium. And this ammonium, it can be mineralized, immobilized, or taken up by the plant. And it can also be absorbed to the surface of soil particles. And that's because our soil has a slight negative charge. And as ammonium has positive charge, it can actually be absorbed to the surface. Ammonium, it can also be fixed in the lattices of our soil clay minerals. So wetting and drying and freezing and thawing can actually expand those lattices, which promotes ammonium fixation. However, this process is not agriculturally significant and it's not substantial in soils here in Alberta, but it is something that can occur with ammonium. And then ammonium can also be converted to nitrate in the process of nitrification, or converted to ammonia and lost via volatilization to the atmosphere. So you can see that with ammonium, there are a lot of potential fates. But next, we're going to dive into nitrification, which is that conversion of ammonium to nitrate, which is the preferred form of nitrogen for plant uptake. So nitrification is also performed by microbes to obtain energy, and it takes place in 2 steps. So in the first, ammonium is converted to nitrite, and in the second, this nitrite is converted to nitrate. And unlike ammonium, nitrate is very mobile in soils due to its negative charge. And it's also the preferred form of nitrogen for plant uptake. You'll also see that this process generates hydrogen protons, and that can actually cause soil acidification over time. So increasing soil acidity with nitrification is a natural process, but in fields where, say, synthetic ammonium-containing fertilizers are applied, this process is accelerated. But in contrast, organic amendments like compost or manure, they actually contain alkaline compounds like calcium and magnesium, which can help buffer changes in soil pH, which I have an example of on this next slide here. So here's an example of how the nitrification of organic amendments impact soil pH compared to synthetic or chemical fertilizers, as shown in this graph from a paper by Dye and colleagues. So you can see that with the organic fertilizer, which I've highlighted in the green, this actually has similar pH values to the check treatment, which is in purple. So that had no fertilizer applied. Well, in contrast, the chemical fertilizer in the orange, you can see there's quite a decline in soil pH over time. And that's due to the acidification happening with the application of these chemical or synthetic fertilizers. So just like other processes in the nitrogen cycle, there's a lot of factors that influence nitrification. So the supply of ammonium. So if our conditions aren't favoring mineralization, which produces ammonium, you're going to have limited nitrification. And then soil pH. So nitrification, you can see in this graph, actually takes place over a wide range in pH, but you can see that the optimum is around 8, and it's substantially reduced at less than 5. And then oxygen supply is also going to impact nitrification, since nitrification is an aerobic process and the bacteria require oxygen to produce nitrate. So if we have soil conditions that permit rapid gas diffusion, like good soil structure, that will influence good oxygen supply. And then, of course, soil, moisture, and temperature. Just like mineralization, these factors, they affect microbial activity and will affect the rate of nitrification. So generally, at higher temperatures and at higher soil moistures, we're going to have increased rates of nitrification, just like with mineralization. So the processes of mineralization and nitrification, they produce ammonium and nitrate, and those can be taken up by the plant and used for growth and development. But now that we know how these are produced in the soil, how is ammonium and nitrate, how are they getting to the plant? So the main transport mechanism is called mass flow. And that just means that nitrate and ammonium, they move with the water toward the plant roots. And this happens because as the water is transpired from the plants, it actually creates a pull or a suction force, and it draws more water up from the soil toward the plant roots. And with that, water carries nitrate and ammonium, and it's taken up by the plant. So ammonium and nitrate can also move via diffusion. So diffusion is just when these nitrogen species are moving from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And that gradient is created when plants actually take up nitrogen, since then that leaves a lower concentration near the root zone. So mass flow is actually more important with nitrate since it's highly mobile. Well, diffusion is more important for ammonium since it can be absorbed to soil particles. And then finally, ammonium and nitrate can also be taken up by root interception, but it's a more minor pathway since it's limited by the area of the root zone. So inorganic nitrogen in soil solution, it may be taken up by the plant or immobilized, but it's also subject to nitrogen losses. So denitrification and volatilization losses result in nitrogen leaving the soil system back to the atmosphere, while leaching or runoff losses result in nitrogen being carried via water off farm or beyond the plant rooting depth. So these nitrogen losses mean that there's less nitrogen available for the crop or to be incorporated into soil organic matter. And these losses also have large environmental implications. So next, we're going to dive into how these different nitrogen losses occur and also what factors influence these losses. So first of all, denitrification. So denitrification is when bacteria, they actually break down the nitrate in several steps, which I've shown here. So nitrate is broken down to nitrite, then to nitric oxide, to nitrous oxide, and finally to nitrogen gas. So the nitrogen species in the blue, those can all be released back to the atmosphere in gaseous form. And with denitrification, this happens under low oxygen conditions. And that's because bacteria, they actually will use nitrate instead of oxygen in order to respire. But in order to do this, they reduce this nitrate and break it down to these different forms of nitrogen. And that can result in nitric oxide, nitrous oxide, or nitrogen gas being released to the atmosphere. So while nitrogen gas is inert, nitrous oxide and nitric oxide being released has environmental consequences. So nitric oxide can actually react in the atmosphere to form acid rain, and nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas, and they can both contribute to smog and declining air quality. So here's just a graph of how nitrous oxide emissions are influenced by soil moisture and fertilizer. So denitrification will typically coincide with soil warming due to that increased microbial activity and heavy precipitation events. And that's because when we have a really heavy rainfall event, we're going to get lower oxygen in the soil, along with adequate amounts of nitrate in the soil. So in this graph, nitrous oxide production is increasing with higher moisture or water-filled pore space. And it also increases with fertilized versus unfertilized treatments. And that's because with a fertilized treatment, we have more nitrate available to actually undergo denitrification. So with leaching, so nitrate can also be lost via leaching. And this is because, again, unlike ammonium, nitrate can't be absorbed to the soil and it's very mobile. And that means it's also easily moved by water. So unlike denitrification, which was a loss due to microbial activity, nitrate leaching is a physical nitrogen loss. So nitrogen leaching may occur if we have nitrate accumulation in the soil, and that can be due to a combination of a high nitrate content or low plant nitrate uptake, and also when our moisture inputs, so precipitation and irrigation, exceed what can be held by the soil and also what can be taken up and transpired by the plant. So with the combination of these conditions, we get that downwards water movement, and that water will carry the nitrate downwards as well. So leaching is typically defined as the nitrate that's moved beyond the crop rooting zone. And once it's beyond that zone of root nitrogen uptake, that nitrate can make its way to the groundwater and is lost. However, one interesting thing to note is that say your nitrate has moved beyond the rooting zone of, say, wheat. It's also possible to recover this nitrogen by planting a deeper rooted crop, such as alfalfa, which can access this nitrate, which has accumulated deeper in the profile due to its deeper rooting system. And of course, leached nitrate can travel to the groundwater, surface water bodies, and coastal areas, polluting water and fueling algae blooms, which deplete oxygen levels and lead to dead zones. So that is an environmental consequence of nitrate leaching. And then our next nitrogen loss is volatilization. So unlike denitrification and leaching, which started with nitrate being lost from the soil system, volatilization is the loss of nitrogen through the conversion of ammonium to ammonia gas, and then that ammonia gas is then released to the atmosphere. So generally, ammonia volatilization losses mainly occurred with surface applied fertilizers and manure. And the reaction for volatilization is shown on the slide. So we have ammonium on one side and ammonia on the other. And these double arrows means that it's a reversible reaction and that both can exist in what we call a dynamic equilibrium. And so that means that we can have both ammonium and ammonia existing simultaneously, and how much of each will depend on the pH and the environmental conditions. So here's a graph of how pH affects the amount of ammonia versus ammonium. And you can see that at a pH above 9.3, ammonia production is favored, while the pH less than 9.3, ammonium production is favored. And also with warmer temperatures, this reaction is also going to shift towards ammonia gas formation. And once that ammonia gas forms, it can actually remain dissolved in its aqueous form in water if the soil is moist. But if conditions are dry and windy, this promotes volatilization losses. And likewise, if that ammonia is already exposed to the surface, it can also more easily escape into the air and result in a loss. So manure is a key source for volatilization losses. And I wanted to connect how different management practices and environmental conditions influence volatilization losses from manure. So to reduce volatilization losses with manure application, it's important to incorporate manure quickly. So within 24 hours is ideal to minimize surface exposure, which increases volatilization losses. And you can see that in this table here, if ammonium or manure is incorporated with 1 day, you only have about 25% losses compared to after 5 days, you'll have 45% volatilization losses. You can also apply manure before a rainfall or irrigation, and that actually moves the ammonium into the soil and reduces its volatilization. And you can see that in wet conditions, we have lower volatilization losses. And we can also apply manure when temperatures are lower and wind speed is low. So with cooler conditions, so say applying manure at night versus the middle of the day can actually reduce volatilization losses by up to 50%. And then manure type will also impact volatilization. So if you have a liquid manure or a slurry, you'll have higher ammonia losses than say a solid manure. And also different manures like poultry manure will have higher ammonia contents compared to beef and typically has higher volatilization losses. So I was curious, what's the difference between nitrogen losses in organic versus conventional? And not surprisingly, organic agriculture has been found to have less nitrogen losses than conventional. And that is due to the use of crop rotations, organic amendments, and the big one is, of course, not using synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, they not only take a lot of energy to produce, and they have a large carbon footprint, and they vastly increase the amount of reactive nitrogen in the system. And that has large environmental impacts, such as the nitrogen losses we just discussed. But in contrast, when we're using recycled forms of nitrogen or nitrogen fixing plants, that helps reduce nitrogen losses losses, reduces waste since we're using recycled nitrogen sources, and energy use. Also, using organic sources of nitrogen compared to synthetic ones, organic sources are more complex substances than inorganic nitrogen. As we went over before, organic sources of nitrogen are available as inorganic nitrogen to the crop or available to be lost. They have to undergo mineralization. But in contrast, if one is using a synthetic fertilizer, you're often directly applying ammonium or nitrate. And while that's more immediately available for plant uptake, that also means it's more immediately available for environmental losses, depending on the conditions and depending on how much nitrogen the plant is taking up. So just to reach the end of our webinar here, here's another diagram of the nitrogen cycle, but with a bit of a different focus. So each component or stage in the nitrogen cycle is categorized as an input, a loss, or a nitrogen component of the environment. So nitrogen inputs would include nitrogen fixation, like lightning or Haber-Bosch process, or biological nitrogen fixation, or atmospheric deposition, or other inputs like animal manure and plant residues. Our outputs include our nitrogen losses, and crop harvest is also considered a loss since we're actually exporting nutrients from the system. But also if you retain a portion of the crop and return it via crop residues, then that's considered an input. And then our nitrogen components of the environment includes our soil organic nitrogen as well as our inorganic nitrogen, like ammonium and nitrate. So I show this nitrogen budget since the key to maintaining productivity and soil health and also minimizing damaging nitrogen losses to the environment is maintaining a balanced nitrogen budget. So if our inputs are greater than our outputs, we may see greater losses with great environmental implications. But on the other hand, if our outputs, including our crop harvest, is greater than our inputs, then we're going to see depleting soil nutrients and soil organic matter over time. So over the long term, we want to aim for a balanced nitrogen budget where inputs allow us to maintain crop growth and productivity and building of soil organic matter without having large nitrogen losses from the system. And how, of course, this is difficult to do. And it's also difficult to obtain a full picture of this diagram. That's a lot of measurements and data requirements. But there are ways to give us a better idea of the inputs versus the exports in our field or in a region. And one of those ways is soil testing. So soil testing can inform us of soil nitrogen levels and inform us how different management practices impact that soil nitrogen. Also, utilizing tools like the nitrogen budgeting app, which I briefly mentioned earlier, can help track nitrogen additions from legumes or other cover crops and the amount of nitrogen being removed in the harvest. And that information can give us a better idea of the nitrogen available on the farm and how to increase nitrogen availability for crops or to build soil organic matter. So just some key takeaways. Here's yet another diagram of the nitrogen cycle, and it's a good visual summary of the different steps of the nitrogen cycle, which we went over today. And the nitrogen cycle, you can see that it involves many steps and forms of nitrogen, and it's also influenced by lots of different factors like biological, physical, and chemical processes. And that's what makes the fate of nitrogen difficult to predict. Of course, nitrogen, it's a key component for plant nutrition and yields, as well as in our soils, especially soil organic matter and soil health. And organic farming practices, including the use of organic amendments or symbiotic nitrogen fixing plants, that helps meet crop nitrogen needs, but also builds soil organic matter and soil health and reduces nitrogen losses, which increases sustainability. And finally, we want to ensure that we have sufficient nitrogen inputs to maintain crop productivity and soil health, but also keep in mind that inputs in excess of plant nitrogen requirements can result in nitrogen losses, which are harmful to both human and environmental health. So a balanced nitrogen budget can help promote nitrogen availability for crops, build soil organic matter, and minimize nitrogen losses. So these are my references, which if you're curious to reading more, those are what I've referred to. And I want to say thank you for listening to me talk about the nitrogen cycle tonight. It's one of my favorite topics. And please let me know if you have any questions. I guess I can stop sharing for now. We can have a question period. And then after that, there is a small survey that I would ask you to fill out. And this would just help Tracy and I plan future webinars and also know, what questions you have, what was helpful, what wasn't about this webinar. So thank you.